Oh, yeah. Life is so much simpler now that everybody's jammed up at home. That's great. Okay. Um, we will survive, as the song says. I will. What is it? I will survive. Gloria Gaynor. I will survive. Okay. So this is section 1.3, which is America's War in Vietnam. And I started on this slide that we have been on before because I want to remind you. And I want to fix something. I think I have already talked about this. Yeah, I've already talked about this. Where I was talking about the Dutch, and I said they were in the Philippines. Actually, the reason I jammed up there was that the Dutch never got to the Philippines. They fought the Spanish. They fought a 30-year war, I think it was, with the Spanish for the Philippines, and they lost. What the Dutch, of course, owned was Indonesia. They colonized Indonesia, and West Timor, as my understanding, my memory is, was a Dutch colony, and that's why East Timor was such a big deal. Anyway, okay, so just cleaning up a little bit of, doing a bit of cleanup work here. But okay, so I want to move on to this particular slide. And the last time I moved on here, Zoom did something bizarre. So I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So I'm just going to move around here. So this section is called America's War in Vietnam. Well, why is it called America's War in Vietnam? Well, I'll tell you why it's called America's War in Vietnam, he answered rhetorically. It's because Vietnam, which I mentioned, had a 2,000-year-long history. I mean, the Vietnam War, as we know it, actually started 2,000 years ago with the Trung sisters, who were two monarchs who ruled Vietnam. And there has been thousands of years of attempts to take over and rule and basically own Vietnam. The difference, really, what you've got is different peoples, right? So the enemies populated much of central Vietnam. The Montagnards are still there. These are so-called by the French because they lived in the mountains. So they were just called like the mountain folk, basically the mountain people. But anyway, that's another whole story. So this was not the Chinese war in Vietnam. This was not the French war in Vietnam. This was the American war in Vietnam. And since I do have talked about the colonial past, you know a little bit more now about why the French, how the French operated here, how the French war basically had operated, and why this is now the American war. All right, just a short note. While my friend there is about to blather on about the about this war, let me make a note that one of the things I forget to talk about, which I should have talked about, but okay, is the fact that this is, as I say here on this slide, the Vietnam conflict. The reason that it's called the Vietnam conflict is that even though I go on talking about it as the Vietnam War, and everybody refers to it as the Vietnam War, so because America never officially declared war on Vietnam, if you go and look up Vietnam War, you will not find it. You will find Vietnam conflict in the Library of Congress. You will find all kinds of references to the Vietnam War, but America never actually declared war on Vietnam. Hence, it is always the Vietnam conflict. That's why this slide says Vietnam conflict in quotation marks. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Okay, so this war takes four. We can divide it into four sections, and I'm going to take up each one of these sections. But the four sections are advising and support, full commitment of troops and material, the war at home, and Vietnamization. Now, I'm pretty sure I have, yeah, I do. Here, I want a slide of this. Here, I'll just pop it up and make it all simple. Okay. Again, let me cover this because Zoom has been doing some funny stuff with my video. So these are the 4 different areas. Basically, yeah, chronologically, this is roughly chronological. Advising and support, then full commitment, then there is the war at home, which we have to deal with, and then Vietnamization. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. And let's start with advising and support. Let me go back to getting us to Vietnam. So here we are. We've been zooming in from the world. Okay, I'll go back to this. Okay, so let's get the big picture, right? So here's little Vietnam. Here we are closer on Vietnam, which I talked about. And now here we are right down at the country level. And you can see the countries around it, which you can, this is where the domino theory comes into play, right? So here's Vietnam, and if South Vietnam falls, because North Vietnam is already communist, then don't pay attention to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's a different thing. Then Laos and Cambodia, Thailand, and then beside it is Burma, Myanmar, now Myanmar, were considered to be next, and then Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. Okay, that's the argument. The first part of the war then is advising and support. The Americans put a number of thousands of troops on the ground in Vietnam. And they did this largely, well, they did this because of John Kennedy, who was the president, became president in 1960. So you will remember that, or not, it's okay, that in the 1950s, 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been the supreme commander during World War II of the Allied forces in the Western Theater, became president and presided over the greatest surge of prosperity overall that has been seen in America since. Basically, more people were raised to basically what would become the middle class than at any other point in America's history. This actually happened in Canada too. This is why the 50s are considered to be such a particularly a particular time where basically the idea was that you were engaged in a war with the communists. Your job was to be a good American or a good North American, and to go along. Basically, you know, people trusted the president and they trusted politicians to fundamentally do the right things and so on. And this will be broken. This what we call consensus is going to be broken by the Vietnam War, largely, and the issues that it raises. Okay, so advising and support begins. So John Kennedy is elected into office barely. He's a little tiny majority, or Richard Nixon. I mean, I'm talking about tiny. It's like 50,000 votes puts Kennedy into office. A very slim. I don't think there has been historically a slimmer majority than that. There may have been one, but it's like, you know, Millard Fillmore or somebody like that from the middle of the 19th century. And so Kennedy begins to, from pressure of the State Department, his own State Department, and the military, to put troops into South Vietnam and support the South Vietnamese. And so this is advising and support, right? That makes sense. Okay, so who are the actors engaged in fighting the Vietnam War? Well, let's go through them. All right, so I'm going to move myself around here. Supporting the North are the first flag that we have up here is the now the flag of Vietnam, which is the all red banner with the yellow star. This is a very typical communist flag. They almost always wear red. Because historically the communist flag was red, were red, and they were called Reds, and so on. So the all red banner with the yellow star in the middle. The next group that supported Vietnam, nation that supported Vietnam was China, and that's the Chinese flag, the central star with the 4 stars around it in a partial arc. And then, of course, the Soviet Union, which is now reverted to its red, white, and blue flag. I think it's actually blue, white, and red with horizontal bars. It's gone back to the Russian flag, the flag of the Russian Federation, from the 19th century. Okay, so North Vietnam is fighting for North Vietnam. The leader is Ho Chi Minh, usually just called Uncle Ho or Ho. And the general in charge, who was agreed by everybody to be a military genius, was General Giap, G-I-A-P, sometimes Giap, depending on, I'm sure my pronunciation is absolutely terrible. I do apologize to the Vietnamese speakers out there. I am sorry. Please feel free to send me emails saying, that was terrible, Tim. We revile you. It's like, that's fair enough. Okay, so that means that the North Vietnamese are now being supplied by 2 big communist countries that are interested in having North Vietnam win and Vietnam becoming an all-communist state, because this is a proxy war, right? So on the left side, that was completely by accident, we've got the communist supporters. And that means that the Chinese and the Russians are going to provide some advisors, but mostly they're going to provide stuff, which is in military jargon is called materiel, which is spelled like material, like this kind of material, except it has an E at the end instead of an A, and the E has an accent aigu over it, materiel. It's a French word meaning basically, and it specifically means military stuff. So artillery and guns and grenades and mines and things that the Vietnamese cannot make for themselves or don't have the factories yet built to make for themselves. Okay, so that's who's going to support the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese Viet Cong, who are fighting against the Americans. On the side of quote unquote democracy, because it's really not a democracy, but anyway, on that side is the people who are fighting or in the field are the Americans. And they are joined by these strongly anti-communist, rabidly anti-communist South Koreans. And so that's the next flag, which is the Tae-Kuk-Ki, called the Tae-Kuk-Ki. And then, so they send a group called the White Badge. This is in itself is an amazing story because the veterans were treated terribly. The reputation of the ROK, that is the Republic of Korea, they just were called the ROK troops in South Vietnam, was fearsome. They fought, they were tough, they didn't complain, they were known to be a very tough, extremely tough. This is partly because, first of all, remember that you're dealing with a country that has just finished fighting its war and has come to a stalemate, and is equally divided. And they are determined that they will not see this happen to another Asian nation. Okay. Then the Australians, who are also rabidly anti-communist, still are to this day. And then the South Vietnamese. And the flag of South Vietnam is the yellow banner with these 3 red bars. And so the South Vietnamese are also fighting for South Vietnam. Right now, I will talk about who those people are, but there is an army which is fielded by the South Vietnamese. Now, that has to be supported by the Americans. So all of the money that's pouring into South Vietnam is coming from America. And all the money that's pouring in North Vietnam is coming from China and the Soviet Union. So it's a proxy war, right? It's another proxy war. All right. Well, by 1963, John F. Kennedy put 16,000 troops on the ground in South Vietnam to advise, not to fight, that's the argument, South Vietnamese troops. So what that means is they provide things like the tracks, which I talk about in the next lecture, I think. But they provide, say, light armor, and they show the Vietnamese how to use them. They're like, here's how you fight with armor, because the Vietnamese are like, whoa, what is this stuff? You know, we don't know. We haven't used this stuff before. So the Americans are there to say, here's the gear we're bringing you. Here's how to use it. This is how we fight in the field. This is how we train. And so they're there as advisors, as military advisors. Remember that most of these advisors would have been in Korea and were used to fighting the Chinese and the North Koreans in Korea. So they have some experience. Okay, so a few years ago, now 4 years ago, as Obama was on his way out, he put American troops back into Iraq and Afghanistan in the same role. And specifically, he gave them the name of advisors, which everybody in my line of work was like, holy crap, you know, what are you doing, Obama? And because the main job here is that you're not sending these troops to fight. You're sending these troops not to be trigger pullers, as they say, but to be to educate tactically, strategically, and to provide support. You know, I wouldn't do that. So your job is to say, Colonel, I wouldn't, no, please don't send your troops down into that valley. It's not a good idea, and so on. So that's advising and support. Then the next thing that comes up is full commitment. So what happens is that Kennedy gets assassinated, right, 1963. And Johnson is, his vice president is elected, not elected, he's appointed president, because that's what happens when you have an assassination, is that the vice president takes over as president. Well, Kennedy was killed, and he still had basically a year to run down the clock to get to the next election. So Johnson took over for that for that period and became the president. And Johnson begins to widen the war, and so he will go. Then Johnson goes up for re-election, basically, although he was never not elected. He was not, and he and good Lord, now I'm trying to think, because it wasn't Nixon. God, was it Muskie? Oh no, it was Barry Goldwater. Oh my God, yeah. How could I forget? Jesus. Okay, so Johnson, as a Democrat, campaigns for withdrawing the men from Vietnam as on a peace platform, and what came to be called his Great Society programs. So Johnson gets elected, and it's a strong election. I mean, Barry Goldwater is hard right wing, and basically wants to go to war. I mean, if Goldwater had been elected, the likelihood is, it certainly looked as though there would have been a nuclear war shortly, because he was a rabid anti-communist, and he was a hawk, and he wanted to fight. Okay, so, but Johnson gets in, which initially looks like a good thing. And between 1964 and 1968, in Johnson's term as a president, he ramps up the troop numbers. So we go from 16,000 under Kennedy to 536,000 under Johnson, right? So we're going from, you really have to think about this, you know, half or a third of basically all the people at Western, when Western is in full swing and we're not facing a virus, to over 500,000 people, right? So, which is, take it all together, the size of London and Windsor, like, you know, like it's a lot of people. Now, these are just the combat soldiers, right? And so for every soldier, there are 10 to 13, it depends on the particular time, of people who are required to support that person, like the people who are in logistics to make sure that the food gets to the front and the weapons get to the front and maintain the helicopters and keep the planes flying and make sure that the trucks keep rolling, and who are not in combat roles. They may be in country, as they call it, but they're not pulling triggers, but they're support, right? So supply and support logistics. And this full commitment part fully Americanizes the war. So the Americans take over fighting, and they say to the South Vietnamese, "Okay, look, you guys are not doing the job, and we can do it better." And so Johnson begins to escalate the war, and this escalation, this widening of the war, is the thing that Tom Paxton sings about in LBJ Told the Nation. Lyndon Johnson Told the Nation. Yeah, I was just looking at the sort of one of the theories about why Kennedy was assassinated, and there are about, there are sort of probably only 2 or 3 billion different theories about why Kennedy was assassinated. But I mean, we will not ever really know. It may be that we will know, because there's a 100-year lock on the files that would reveal what was known and when it was known and so on. So you folks might live to see, 100 years from 1963, why Kennedy was assassinated. I don't think it's going to be the most important thing in our lives, but anyway. But the argument, one of the arguments is, and it can be quite compelling, was that Kennedy had suggested that if he was elected to a second term, and it looked as though he probably would be, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which made him look good because he was strong and people like Kennedy. I mean, he was beautiful and pretty, and he had Jackie Kennedy as a wife, and people liked him. The likelihood is that Kennedy probably would have been reelected. He was promising covertly to withdraw American troops from Vietnam. That was the story. And so the argument is that the Texas oil men who were supporting the war because it was good for oil, it was good for big business. It's good for everybody. Every war industry stood to benefit from the war in Vietnam because it was a wonderful place to pour all kinds of material endlessly. We just keep pouring it on, there was a lot of, so you could make planes and helicopters and, and widen the war and make tanks and, armored personnel carriers and all kinds of stuff and keep people employed. And, it was fantastic. It looked like it was fantastic for the economy. It was a war economy. And if you're interested in this, you might look at Seymour Melman's book called A Permanent War Economy, which is exactly about this. Because it was new. It looked like it was new. Actually, it had been running for a while, but that's another thing. So the suggestion is that the Texas oil men basically said, okay, we got to get rid of Kennedy because he's gonna pull the troops out. And we want our own boy, and we want to Texan in. So we're going to bring in LBJ if he agrees to widen the war, and we'll make sure he gets reelected. And that's what happened. Johnson began to use tools that hadn't been used since World War II, really, but now they were significantly more fulsome. And specifically, I'm talking here about area bombing, or what's called saturation bombing. During World War II, under the British, mostly American crews, American and British crews, flew bombing raids, bombing missions over Italy and France and Germany in 1943, 1944, and they saturation bombed or area bombed Europe to rubble. The thing about area bombing is that it is not clear whether it actually helped to win the war. It is not clear. There is an ongoing fight about it now. However, that didn't stop Johnson from looking at that and saying, we're going to do that in Vietnam. They won't be able to resist us. And so he began using these B-52s, the Superfortress or Stratofortress. The B-52 is so enormously more powerful than the B-17s or B-24s that had flown before them at the end of World War II, which were considered to be, they were massive bombers and they unloaded huge dumps of bombs. But B-52s literally could drop tons of bombs in one shot. And so Johnson was like, yeah, we're gonna use those. Okay, I'm gonna pause here.